Hello friends, my name is Marinez, and today I'll be talking about the top 10 best books I've ever read according to Goodreads. Yes, I am jumping on this bandwagon. I've been seeing this video cycling around. I saw one from Sajid and one from Riley, so you know, why not do it too? If you are enjoying these as much as I am, you're welcome. If you are sick of them now, I know that's the way it goes. Basically, I went to my red shelf on Goodreads and I sorted them all by average rating. Harry Potter shows up on this list multiple times and I just booted it out because no need to include it. There is another series that has 2 books show up in the list and I just kind of lumped them into one. So with that all said, the best book that I have ever read according to Goodreads is I was so mad when I saw this immediately. I almost didn't even want to continue on with making this darn video. And the funny thing is that I forgot I even marked this as read on Goodreads because I went through it and heavily annotated it for about 260 pages, which I think is like 40% of the way through. But then, I always think of this book as DNF'd, I didn't finish it, but I guess I did skim to the end. I even was on a live show to talk about this when it came out, so I skim read enough to participate in that conversation, which made me feel good about marking it as read on Goodreads. Do I agree that this is one of the best books that I've ever read? Absolutely not. If you know anything about me, you know that I hate this series and I just absolutely abhor Sarah J. Maas's writing style. And the fact that it's this book specifically that everybody fawns over, oh man, it makes me so upset because this is where I quit. I got through ACOTAR for as bad as it was, and I started reading this one, and this is the one where I had to throw my hands up because not only was everything as bad as ACOTAR in terms of writing and characterization and plots and the meandering plot that was just spinning in circles and circles and circles, but this is where Reese as a main love interest really steps into his full manipulative abuse sort of role. And I honestly, by the time that we got to his huge monologue about why he did everything for Farah's own good, including drugging her, violating her consent time after time, and then just continuing to treat her like such a sexual object in this book, I was sick to my stomach, honestly, reading this, and not only reading it, but knowing that people hold this up as a standard, and especially ship Reese and Farah. It is such an abusive relationship. It is beyond me. It is beyond me. As I mentioned, I hate her writing. It gets so bad in here with the way that she forces tone, abuses punctuation, and just repeats things over and over again. She sucks at internal logic and continuity. This, in fact, is one of the worst books that I've ever read, and the fact that I have to hold it up as #1 on this list is an insult to me personally. Coming in at #2 with an average 4.60 rating is 400 Souls, edited by Ibram X. Kendi and Keisha Blain. This is a really interesting work that tells of the 400-year history of the Black American experience. Each contributor takes a period of 5 years and shares something about that time, so it isn't a straightforward history. It is rather a collection of essays and poems inspired by these chunks of 5 years. It felt very much like everybody got the prompt of here are your 5 years, tell us something about it. And some people went a really straightforward route and told us about a historical figure from that time or a piece of history. And some people went about it in a creative writing sort of way. And so they wrote poetry or an essay that was a much more artistic interpretation of the time period. And even though each author did something slightly different and in their own writing style and tone, there was something very cohesive about it and that felt very communal. I was really impressed by this, and I rated it as 4 stars when I first got it because I think part of me was expecting something really different, and also I listened to it on audiobook, which was a great experience, but I felt even then that I needed the physical book to really hone in on which essays or portions worked the best for me. So 4 stars for me, probably a little bit higher, and definitely one that I would reread and that I would recommend. Coming in at #3 with 4.58 stars is The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse by Charlie Mackesy. I had heard a lot about this before I picked it up, so I think that my expectations of what it actually was really high. And so at first I was kind of let down by what it ended up being, especially what the story is here, which is in fact really simple. But once I kind of stepped back and let go of my expectations and just sort of enjoyed this for what it was, I found a new appreciation for it. I think when it comes to achieving what it set out to achieve, it is very effective. It is a bit of like warmth and coziness in book form, and it leans very heavily not only into its message, but into the aesthetic of the whole thing. Even in the moments where it's just sort of like half drawn, there was something just really beautiful in the simplicity of it all. I will say that while I appreciated the way that the font fit in with the overall look, it was sometimes a little bit difficult to read. I can see myself rereading this when I need a pick-me-up. I think that this would make an excellent gift for anybody embarking on a new journey, like a graduation gift or anything like that, because it's got that sort of like hopeful message. And I also really was struck with how much I wanted to add to this, like scribble and journal and like color in this. So I think it was pretty effective in that regard too, that I don't know, it made me want to art. A really sweet experience that I gave 4 out of 5 stars. Number 4 is White Tears, Brown Scars by Ruby Hamad, and this is also 4.58 average star rating. I think that this is well written and incredibly informative, and the only complaint that I had about it, I think, doubles as a strength, especially for people who are using this as an introduction or a primer into this idea of how white feminism betrays women of color. And it is that often this work was wider than it is deep. Hamad is doing more work to cover a lot of area and look a little past her own experiences rather than digging deep into her own experiences. I actually reread this year. I got this recommendation from a random comment in a TikTok that was just like not at all about books or book talk. Somebody was recommending this in a conversation about white women tears. So I picked this up and I read it. And then again this year, there was another trend going around that was like weaponizing white women tears. So I passed on the recommendation, like I made a video to recommend this book, and then I also reread it and found it just as good and informative and well written and well thought out as I did the first time. I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. Number 5 is The Return of the King, and The Two Towers was also on this list. The Return of the King has an average star rating of 4.55. I really love The Lord of the Rings. I didn't the first time that I read it through. I was kind of overwhelmed with all of the detail and like the rambling nature of the story. But then I listened to a dramatized audiobook. It was like the BBC radio version of it, and through an abridged version, I fell in love with the characters and like the core story. So then I went back and listened to an unabridged version, and I was like, oh, okay. I don't know if I tricked myself into really loving this, but I do. It is one of my favorite stories, a classic for a reason. Some of my favorite characters, lush world building and writing, every detail about the flora and fauna you could possibly want. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Number 6 is Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, and this is a nonfiction book that I absolutely think changed my worldview about some things. It is an argument that didn't feel like entirely new, but that I had never seen laid out in this way or like verbalized in this way. And I just feel like this had such a huge impact on me. As I was reading it, I couldn't stop talking to other people about it and just explaining what Wilkerson was presenting in this argument. And still to this day, whenever like we're talking about racism, which is like always, I think about what Caste laid out for me. I found this well researched and well written. I enjoyed the way that she framed things, and while I found it like difficult to read for the subject matter and for the way that it was challenging me, it was also incredibly compelling, and once I started reading it, I couldn't stop. The only reason that I did not give this 5 out of 5 stars when I read it was that I felt like it maybe could have been tightened a little bit, especially in the way that it was organized. But otherwise, like I said, a book that I will always say like changed my mind. So I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. Number 7 is A Storm of Swords with a 4.54 average rating. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars, but I'm going to be honest with you. I definitely read all of these books, and we dedicated a podcast episode to each one. So there is a whole podcast episode episode of me talking about how I felt about this book, but that entire experience, the whole series itself has blended in a way that I couldn't tell you specifically what was in this book at all. Like, gone from my memory. It is all smushed into one with like big plot highlights. I've always meant to go back and reread these, but man, these are like the best books that I never want to read again, is how I describe them, because the actual experience of reading them, like in the moment, wasn't great. Like I was struggling through a lot of it, but in retrospect, I always liked the books much better. And I love talking about them. I love reflecting on them. Like, after I was done, I was like, oh, not bad. But while I was reading, I was like, oh my God, how much longer? and that's generally my complaint with George R.R. Martin. He surely knows how to craft a world. And I think that he gets a lot of the credit that he gets simply for the expansiveness of his world. He made a big, giant world with lots of characters. And it's not to take anything away from him for that, but he isn't perfect. And his books tend to be too long. He needs someone editing him really badly, because it isn't only like macro level too long. He does a ton of micro level repetition. He has a tendency of like hanging onto something and just beating you over the head with it, whether that's a catchphrase or like a characterization that he really wants to emphasize. He just goes ham. And if somebody had slowed him down, I feel like that I would have loved these even more. But as it is, even with all of those pain points, again, some of my favorite characters are in here. There were moments that were just completely shocking. I don't recommend them easily, but I still, like, I appreciate them. According to Goodreads, I gave this 4 out of 5 stars, but you know, what? Memory? None. With a 4.52 rating, at number 8 is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. Oof. Oh, buddy. I loved this when I read it. Like, I'm not going to lie. I absolutely loved the framing device, the story within the story, the unreliable narrator. I loved what a little shit Kavoth was. Like, I fell for all of it. I loved the world. I loved being in the school and watching him learn. I loved that he was like awesome at everything. Like, all of it was just so enjoyable for me in the moment. I am terrified of rereading this book because I have a feeling that it would not play the same for 2022 or beyond, Madi. I've heard so much about Patrick Rothfuss as a person, and have seen in some of his other writing in social media, and like even on a panel that I heard him talk in, some of his like casual misogyny that I've then used as context to look back on this work, and I'm like, oh no, because oh no, oh man, this one hurts so bad, because there is, I think, a lot good here and a lot of skill, specifically with storytelling, and a lot of elements and tropes that are right up my alley. But I never read the second book either, because I was like, I'll read the second book when the third book comes out, you know, so I can kind of space it out. And the third book is never coming out. So will I ever reread this and like test that theory? Oh, it hurts. That's all I have to say about that, is that this one hurts. Number 9 is We Are Not From Here by Jenny Torres Sanchez with a 4.52 rating. I was so pleasantly surprised to see this in the top 20 because I really enjoyed this book. I think that it was so effective and impactful in telling the story of 3 teens who were riding La Bestia to migrate to the United States. Even for all of the ways that this tells like a very straightforward story, there were also so many things that I felt were nuanced in the telling of it. I love the way that Torres Sanchez showed us their home in Guatemala and showed us the good parts, and then like what would cause somebody to leave their home. Like, how bad would the circumstances have to be to feel like migrating would be the best answer? And then as they are moving through Mexico, she did such a good job balancing showing us the perils of it with like the goodness of certain people along the way. So again, really balancing the portrayal of like the good and bad in people, and then like having all this commentary about what happens once these kids reach the US border and how they are treated once they get there. This was really, really difficult to read, and it launched me into reading more about La Bestia and about migration and just kind of better informing myself on the subject. The only downsides to me were a little bit of unevenness in pacing, because we start in the beginning to really establish the place that these people come from and them as characters. It is a bit of a slow start, and then the ending is almost frenetic. So it feels a little bit imbalanced while you are reading it, and there is some simplicity because this is young adult. So some of the motivations and characterizations are a little on the simple side, but again, she balances that in the nuance of the telling. If you can withstand the content, I highly recommend, and I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Number 10 is So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. This is an excellent primer in talking about race and anti-racism. It is incredibly accessible and concise and well thought out. And the thing that impressed me the most about this is the care with which Oluo approaches the subject. There's something really, really patient and understanding about the way that she writes and about the way that she explains things that I just admire. I don't think that we should expect that from anybody who has experienced the sort of racism that she covers in this book, and yet she finds it in herself to share this education with that really patient and caring sort of air and tone. So I think that this is such an excellent place to start because of that. And she gives you very like clear and clean-cut ways to approach these topics, to reframe conversations, and to generally acknowledge that while this is a really hard topic, we have to talk about it. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. That's it for me today. If you have read or would like to read any of the books that I mentioned, let's chat in the comments. Also, if you'd like to hear about the next 5 books on this list, I'll have that video up on my Patreon, which I mostly use as a tip jar. It's just pledge what you want if you want to support the content that I do make, and then every so often I drop a little bonus in there or an extra nugget. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. And the only reason that there's a difference is because the author tells us. She like knocks us over the head with the fact that Reese is the good guy and Tamlin is the bad guy. And so, I don't know, people just go along with it without like taking a step back and being like, actually, they're doing the same thing. Every time I hold this up, it reminds me that this is the copy that I own of this series, and what I really want is the Folio Society version of this, but I haven't been able to convince myself to actually purchase